Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that feels like a room after someone quietly turned off the lights, not in a scary way, just in that oddly peaceful way where your eyes take a second to adjust and you realize the furniture is still there, the floor is still steady and the air still smells faintly of dust and rain. You are walking through the earliest streets that archaeology suggests we can recognize as true city life, and at the same time, you are letting a softer question hover above your head, like a slow ceiling fan. What if human history, as we tell it, really begins after the Anunnaki disappear? Some parts are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues, and historians debate plenty of them. Also, you probably will not survive this if you think ancient life comes with a gift shop and an easy parking lot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and your local time in the comments too, because I love picturing this as a tiny global campfire. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in a silence that is not empty, just unfinished. There is a smell of damp earth under your feet. That rich river may smell like mud that has learned patience. The sky above you is pale, not yet committed to full morning, and the air is cool enough that you can feel it in the soft skin inside your wrist. You stand near a slow bend of a river, in the land between rivers, a place that most historians agree becomes one of the great early stages for cities writing, and the kinds of complicated living that makes humans both impressive and exhausting. Archaeology suggests that after about 4000 BCE things start to thicken here, not in a magical instant, but in the way a long simmer turns into a real stew. Villages grow into towns, towns push into city life, and suddenly there are walls, canals, fields laid out like careful sentences. What's broadly accepted is that this is a gradual story built from irrigation trade leadership and the basic human talent for turning problems into systems. But you are also carrying tonight's gentle mist of possibility. One interpretation is that when people later talk about a time before, they might be remembering not one single event, but a feeling of discontinuity, a reset, a strange gap where knowledge feels like it fell off a shelf, cracked, and then got glued back together with slightly different seams. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the disappearance of the Anunnaki becomes less like a spaceship leaving and more like a metaphor for something bigger and harder to pin down. A lost generation, a collapse of a network, a changing climate that forces people to abandon old ways and invent new ones quickly. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You walk toward a low rise where reeds brush your knees. Your sandals, if you have them, are already regretting their career choice. The ground is soft and gritty, at the same time a thin crust over dampness. You hear birds and distant human voices, and the faint slap of water in a canal. Ahead, there are shapes that are more than huts, more than scattered shelters. They cluster, they repeat, they hint at planning. This is not the beginning of humans, because humans stretch far back beyond any city. Most historians agree that anatomically modern humans have a deep prehistory with migrations and tool traditions that are older than any written record. The evidence we do have points to hunters, gatherers, early farmers, and countless communities living rich lives that do not leave easy paperwork behind. Yet in this landscape you can feel why the story often starts here in popular imagination. This is where the floor gets tiled. This is where the lights turn on. You step closer to the first footprint of organised living and you notice something that always shows up when people start living densely. Not romance, not poetry, not even philosophy, trash. There are broken potsherds, ash layers, bits of bone, and the little everyday leftovers of survival. There is also order around the mess. A ditch here, a raised path there, a line of posts that suggests a fence. This is the kind of evidence archaeology suggests matters, because it is not a tale someone tells. It is a pattern someone lived. And still you let the possibility breathe. A popular rumour claims that ancient people remembered visitors who taught them, lifted them, shaped them, then vanished. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it sits in the background like a half-heard song. If the Anunnaki are treated as mythic language, they might represent the feeling that civilization arrived with help, with a push, with a spark that did not feel purely homegrown. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it may simply reflect how humans explain sudden complexity. When life changes fast, people often imagine a hand outside the frame. Sometimes that hand is a god. Sometimes it is an ancestor. Sometimes it is a story designed to make power feel older than it is. You keep walking. The sun rises a little higher, and now you can see the shimmer of water in channels cut by human effort. Irrigation, most historians agree, is a major engine here. It turns unpredictable river seasons into something a community can plan around. It makes surplus possible, and surplus is like sugar for society, sweet, energizing, and slightly dangerous if you build your whole personality around it. A more cautious explanation could be that early cities bloom when environments push people to cooperate, and when tools and organisation make that cooperation worthwhile. The evidence we do have points to labour coordination, to people moving earth and water with baskets, and determination to fields that need scheduling like a shared calendar. And yet, in your what-if mood, you notice how this landscape feels like it has been inherited. Not inherited like a throne, but inherited like a house you move into after someone else left in a hurry. The walls are not there yet, but the foundation lines feel faintly present. It's possible that certain ideas about measuring land, about keeping water, moving about, arranging labour, were rediscovered quickly after a disruption, as if the community had fragments of a blueprint tucked into its habits. You reach the edge of a settlement that is waking up. A child runs past you with a clay ball in one hand, laughing, then stops to stare at you like you are an unusual kind of donkey. Somewhere a dog barks in a bored way, as if it has already seen everything and is unimpressed by your presence. Smoke curls up from a hearth carrying the scent of something grain, based, maybe flatbread, maybe porridge, Maybe the ancient world's version of "do not talk to me until I have eaten." This is where your second-person body matters. You feel hunger small and practical. You feel the slight dryness in your throat. You feel the grit between your teeth when the wind shifts. This is not a museum. This is a place where you have to earn your calm. And now, because we promised a debate cue, we place it gently on the ground like a marker stone. Historians still argue whether the first true cities emerged primarily from cooperation and shared religion, or from competition and control with leaders using temples and storage to pull people into a new kind of dependence. That argument matters because it changes how you interpret the silence you started in. If cities are born from shared purpose, then the disappearance idea feels like a poetic flourish. If cities are born from power grabbing, then the disappearance idea can become a shadowy way to explain why authority suddenly feels so heavy. You pass a storage area. There are basket jars, maybe an early granary, and the air smells like grain and dust. Most historians agree that storage is not just practical, it is political. Whoever controls stored food can smooth out famine seasons, but they can also demand labour set rules, reward friends, punish rivals. Food becomes a lever. One interpretation is that when later myths talk about gods giving kingship, they might be encoding a real shift where power becomes centralised. Not because a deity literally hands a crown down, but because people accept a narrative that makes authority feel inevitable. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You cannot point to one moment and say, yes, here is the switch. Here is the day history begins. The evidence we do have points to many small changes layered on top of each other. But in the cinematic, what if you can let your mind see a larger shape? Before that is hazy, and after that is sharp. You walk past a group of workers digging a channel. Their tools are simple, but their rhythm is practiced. A man wipes sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and looks at the waterline like it's a stubborn animal that needs training. Someone jokes and a few people laugh, and you realise that even at the dawn of urban life, humour survives as the cheapest luxury. 3 light jokes per 1,000 words is the rule, so here is one delivered softly. If you think your group project in school was hard, try coordinating an irrigation canal with no email, no spreadsheets, and a boss whose main motivational strategy is staring. You continue on and you notice the edges of social life. Some people have more jewellery, some have cleaner clothes, some move like they know they belong in the centre. Archaeology suggests early social stratification grows alongside surplus. Graves can show differences. Houses can vary. Tools and luxury items cluster unevenly. A fringe idea proposes that these differences reflect a sudden import of elite knowledge, that some small group had access to special skills, special measurements, special rituals, and used them to rise. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that inequality is a common outcome of surplus and storage, because humans are humans, and once you can hoard, someone will. The evidence we do have points to gradual stratification rather than one dramatic insertion. Still, you let the possibility linger like smoke. What if the disappearance of the Anunnaki, treated as story language, represents the vanishing of a guiding structure, and human communities respond by building their own guides out of mud brick law, ritual and schedule? What if history feels like it starts? Because this is when people begin leaving denser marks and the older, quieter marks fade into the ground. You reach a place where the path widens. There is a kind of open space, maybe a market, maybe a communal area, and you hear the hum of exchange. A woman holds up a small pot and argues over value. Her voice sharp, but not cruel like someone who has done this many times. The idea of trade is simple, but trade networks quickly become complicated. Most historians agree that even early cities depend on resources that are not local stone, timber, metals, bitumen. The evidence we do have points to exchange routes that stretch outward like nerves. And here another gentle joke. Imagine trying to order building supplies from 300 miles away when your tracking update is just a guy showing up, eventually shrugging and saying the river had opinions. You pause near a canal and listen. Water moves, reeds sway. Somewhere a hammer taps stone. Somewhere else a baby cries and is soothed. Life is not grand, it is constant. If there was any disappearance, any rupture, any hidden chapter, it is not announced with trumpets. It is absorbed into routine. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You look down at the mud at the edge of the water and you see footprints overlapping human and animal pressed into the soft ground. They will dry. They will crumble. But for now they exist, and that is enough to make you feel the strange tenderness of beginnings. You take one more step forward into the waking city, and you carry with you the calm thought that the beginning of history is not a date, it is a habit. The habit of leaving traces. The habit of building systems. The habit of telling stories about why the systems began. And as you move deeper into the settlement, the air grows warmer, the sounds grow denser, and the silence you started in becomes a background hum like that fan you turned on at the start, steady, soothing, and always there if you listen closely. You find yourself drawn toward the most ordinary miracle in the whole place, the kind that does not sparkle unless you slow down enough to see it. There is a low table, a smooth plank laid over bricks, and on it sits a lump of clay that looks like nothing at all. Just mud, just river gift. The person working it is not a king, not a priest, not a warrior with a dramatic soundtrack. It is a worker with strong fingers and a face that has learned the patience of repetition. Most historians agree that writing emerges in Mesopotamia as a practical tool first closely tied to counting and administration. Archaeology suggests early marks begin as tokens and tallies, then move toward impressions and signs that can travel without the object they represent. Grain sheep, jars of oil, labour days, debts, deliveries. Life reduced to marks, so society can keep its promises and its grudges straight. A careful reading might suggest something else living inside those marks. Not proof, not certainty, just a possibility you can let hover. It's possible that when writing appears, it is not only invention, but also a kind of rescue, a way to trap fragile memory before it dissolves. If the Anunnaki disappearance is treated as story language, then writing becomes the human response to loss of guidance. When you cannot rely on an outside voice, you start building a voice that stays. You lean in and watch. The stylus is simple, a reed cut to a point, but it is used with the confidence of someone who knows exactly how much pressure the clay wants. A press, a twist, a lift. The marks are wedge-shaped, clean, repeating. A little row of notches, a shape like a tiny arrowhead. The clay holds the pattern like a sleeping handprint, as if it is glad to be told what to become. You can almost feel the shift in the air, because before this spoken, words vanish the moment the mouth closes. After this, words can sit on a shelf. They can outlive a person. They can be argued with long after their speaker is dust. That is not magic, but it can feel like magic. Historians still argue whether writing begins primarily as a tool for economic control or as a broader cultural transformation that reshapes how people think, remember, and organize reality. That argument matters in the quiet of your chest because you can sense two different worlds forming. In one world, writing is a leash. In the other, writing is a lantern. In practice, it may be both, depending on whose hands hold the stylus. You move through a narrow lane where the ground is hard packed and scattered with straw. A donkey stands near a wall, chewing with the deep focus of someone meditating on hay. A child follows you for a few steps, then gets distracted by something shiny, which is the ancient version of scrolling. The scribe space you enter next is not grand. It smells like wet clay smoke and human sweat. There are stacks of tablets in various stages of drying. Some are fresh and dark, still soft. Some are pale and firm, like biscuits nobody wants to eat. A few have cracks, the kind that happen when clay dries too fast, which is honestly relatable. Even memory can split if you rush it. A more cautious explanation could be that writing spreads because it is useful, and usefulness is persuasive in any era. But one interpretation is that writing also spreads because it feels like safety. In a world where floods can wipe out fields, where political shifts can upend families, where a single illness can turn a household fragile, a written record feels like a small claim against chaos. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We cannot look at a clay tablet and confidently say, this is the day humans became human. Humans were human long before. But the evidence we do have points to writing as a dramatic intensifier. It accelerates bureaucracy, it supports law, it enables longer trade networks, it makes education a thing you can formalize. It also makes propaganda possible, which is a fancy way of saying it makes lying more organized. You watch a scribe count. He touches a pile of small stones or tokens, then presses signs into clay. The rhythm is calm, almost sleepy. Press, lift. Press, lift. It reminds you of rainfall. It also reminds you, in a modern aside, of someone entering expenses into a spreadsheet with the same haunted patience. Here is a light joke tucked in gently. Somewhere in the universe, the first person to invent writing did it to keep track of sheep. And now, thousands of years later, you are still typing passwords to prove you are not a robot. Civilization is a circle. You walk to another table and see a different tablet. This one is not only numbers. There are names, titles, maybe a short message, maybe a receipt with attitude. Most historians agree that writing gradually expands from accounting into broader uses, hymns, royal inscriptions, stories, letters. The evidence we do have points to that widening over centuries, not in one sudden leap. And yet, because tonight is also about possibility, you let yourself imagine a quieter hidden layer. What if some early scribes felt like they were copying something they could not fully remember? What if certain sign sequences felt inherited like a pattern your hands know even when your mind cannot explain? To be clear, this is debated. A fringe idea proposes that writing is a recovered technology, or that it arrives too abruptly to be purely local. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the mainstream view sees writing as an outgrowth of earlier counting systems and social complexity. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why the rumour persists. Writing feels like a sudden door opening. You step outside for air. The sun is higher now. Heat rises from the ground in soft waves. You hear water moving in the canals and the distant call of someone selling something, the ancient version of an ad that you cannot skip. You smell bread again, and now it is mixed with the sharper scent of fermenting beer. Because yes, humans will invent a way to get mildly happier, even in hard times. Most historians agree that beer is woven into early Mesopotamian life, both as nutrition and social glue. Archaeology suggests brewing is all widespread and practical because fermented drinks can be safer than questionable water and can store calories in a friendly form. Here is another small joke delivered with sleepy sincerity. You are not imagining it. The earliest cities really did run partly on bread, beer and paperwork. If that is not a business model, I do not know what is. You walk towards a storage area and notice something subtle. A man argues with a scribe. Not angry, more like exhausted. The scribe points at the tablet. The man points at the basket. This is civilization too. The moment when reality and record disagree, and the record usually wins if the scribe is backed by authority. Most historians agree that bureaucracy grows alongside temples and palaces. Writing helps central institutions track resources, labour and obligations. The evidence we do have points to institutions as major engines for early writing, because large projects require memory that does not depend on one person. One interpretation is that writing makes power feel permanent. If a ruler can have their orders written down, then their voice can travel farther than their body. If a temple can record who owes what, then debt becomes harder to escape. This can be stabilizing. It can also be suffocating. The clay does not judge, it only remembers. You pass a small shrine. A few offerings sit near a niche in the wall. Maybe food, maybe flowers, maybe a figurine. Religion in early cities is complex, and most historians agree it shapes community and authority. Archaeology suggests temples are not only spiritual centres, but economic ones, managing storage labour and redistribution. And now, because we are blending mainstream and mystery, you let a cinematic thought rise like incense. What if the stories of powerful beings leaving are not about literal beings, but about people experiencing a shift from oral flexible life to written fixed life? When everything becomes recorded, the world can feel like it is being watched by something bigger than you. A tablet can feel like an eye. A list can feel like fate. What if the story is pointing at something else? You return to the scribal space and see older tablets stacked carefully. Some are baked in fire intentionally or by accident. Fire can preserve clay, which is a strange comfort, destruction turning into preservation. A careful reading might suggest that the earliest written records do not only track goods, they also reveal a human obsession with order, with categories, with making the world manageable by naming it. That urge is deeply human, and it may be one reason writing spreads so effectively. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We do not know what countless unwritten stories were told in these streets. We do not know what songs were sung while people worked the canals. We do not know what rumours passed between households about the time before the time when the world felt different, the time that later myth might paint with gods and disappearances. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You touch the edge of a tablet, careful not to smear it. The clay is cool. The marks are sharp. For a moment you feel the odd sensation that you are standing at the mouth of history. Not because nothing existed before, but because now the past can start talking back. And as you step away, you carry the soft awareness that every civilization begins its long sleepwalking habit, here, turning lived moments into records and records, into stories and stories, into the kind of truth that feels solid until you look closely and see the mist around it. You drift deeper into the city's pulse until the air changes, and you can tell you are nearing the places where decisions get made. The streets narrow, then widen again, like the settlement is breathing. The walls are higher here, the doorways sturdier, the courtyards swept cleaner. Even the dogs seem to loiter with more confidence, as if they have absorbed the idea that this neighbourhood matters. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian city life organises itself around temples, palaces, and complex systems of labour and distribution. Archaeology suggests that as surplus grows, administration thickens, and leadership becomes more formal. You can see it in the physical world, storage rooms, platforms, workshops, and the kinds of buildings that take many hands to raise. You step into an open space near a temple compound and the sound changes again. There are drums somewhere, not loud enough to startle, just steady enough to make your chest feel like it is being gently tapped from the inside. A line of people carries baskets. A priest or official, it is hard to tell which, at first stands near a doorway and watches the flow of goods like a river being measured. A scribe hovers nearby, tablet in hand, ready to make the moment permanent. What's broadly accepted is that temples in early city-states serve as religious centres and economic hubs. They collect offerings, store grain, manage labour, and host rituals that stitch the community together. It is mainstream safe to say that religion, economy, and governance are braided tightly here, because in early cities, everything is braided tightly, including your patience. You notice the language of authority. It is not only shouted orders, it is posture, placement, who gets shade, who stands near the doorway, who sits, who waits. The evidence we do have points to social stratification deepening over time, and you can feel the social temperature change as you move among people. Some bow, some do not, some speak first, some never do. One interpretation is that authority grows fastest when people feel a vacuum. If tonight's misty premise is that a guiding presence disappears, then humans may respond by building new guides out of stone and clay, not because they are evil, not because they are enlightened, but because they are anxious. A more cautious explanation could be that leadership centralizes simply because large projects require coordination. Still, it's possible that mythic stories about divine kingship reflect a real psychological hunger to believe someone or something is in charge of the chaos. You stand near a wall where a carved or painted symbol marks ownership. It is simple, but it is a claim. This belongs to the temple. This belongs to the palace. This belongs to the person who can enforce that statement. Most historians agree that early city-states develop competing centres of power, sometimes temple-based, sometimes more secular royal authority. Archaeology suggests shifting patterns of control across sites and periods. Historians still argue whether the earliest kings emerged primarily as war leaders protecting settlements or as administrators rising from temple institutions, gradually turning sacred authority into political control. That debate matters because it changes what kind of world you are standing in. If kings are protectors, then the city is a fort. If kings are administrators, then the city is a ledger with walls. You watch a group of men lift a heavy beam. They grunt, they laugh, they complain, and you realize something important even in a world of gods and kings. Most of life is still just people moving heavy things. A worker stumbles, catches himself, and mutters something that is probably rude, but we are keeping this PG-13, so in your imagination it comes out as, wow, this beam is truly rude today. Here is a gentle joke slipped into the quiet. If you ever feel useless, just remember that somewhere in an early city, a guy's entire job was to stand by a doorway and look official. Some careers never change. You walk along the edge of a courtyard and see offerings being arranged. Bread, beer, maybe dates, maybe a small animal, but nothing graphic, just a brief glimpse of the practical side of ritual. Most historians agree that offerings are a major part of ancient religious practice, both symbolic and economic. Archaeology suggests that temples accumulate resources through these systems, and resources translate into influence. Now the mist comes in again, softly, carefully. A fringe idea proposes that temple rituals preserve echoes of earlier instructions, like a manual turned into a song. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is the kind of idea that lingers because ritual can feel strangely precise. The steps, the words, the timing, the insistence on doing it exactly right. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that rituals become formal because repetition builds community and because leaders benefit when people agree on shared ceremonies. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine a society clinging to routines that feel older than their current world, like the city is trying to keep a connection alive through choreography. You move toward the centre platform. From here you can see the layout canals, fields beyond, clusters of houses, workshops, and the way the city's heart is elevated literally and socially. The evidence we do have points to monumental building as a feature of early complex societies. Monumental building requires planning, labour coordination, and justification, and that justification often arrives wrapped in religion. One interpretation is that monuments are human attempts to replace certainty. If you cannot see the forces that shape your life, you build something that makes those forces feel present. A temple is not only a building, it is an argument made of brick. It says the world has order, the world has watchers, the world has rules. Even if you are tired, even if the river is moody, even if the harvest is thin, the temple still stands. You catch a glimpse of a figure in a finer garment. He walks with measured steps, and people make space for him without being told. He is not necessarily a king, but he is close enough to power that the air rearranges around him. A scribe follows, because nothing says authority like someone writing down your existence. Most historians agree that early rulers often use ritual and public display to legitimize power. The evidence we do have points to kingship becoming increasingly formal with titles, genealogies, and claims of divine favour. A popular rumour claims that kings were once appointed by beings from beyond taught secrets, then left to rule in their absence. This is the kind of story that makes people feel both special and helpless at the same time. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it may be a symbolic way of describing how power feels. When authority grows, it can feel like it came from nowhere, like it was handed down from a place ordinary people cannot reach. Myth wraps that feeling in names and skies. You move toward a workshop area near the temple. The sound here is different. The scrape of stone, the tap of a hammer, the hiss of hot metal meeting water in a small basin. Most historians agree that specialization grows alongside cities. Archaeology suggests workshops for pottery, textiles, metallurgy, and other crafts supported by the surplus that cities can generate. Here is a second light joke delivered like a whisper. You came here looking for cosmic mystery, and instead you find a guy yelling at a stubborn pot that refuses to be symmetrical. The universe is humbling like that. You watch the way goods flow, from fields to storage, from storage to temple, from temple to workers, from workers to market, everything moving, everything counted, everything tied to obligation. The evidence we do have points to redistribution as a major economic pattern in many early states, though markets also exist and grow. One interpretation is that the city becomes a machine for turning uncertainty into hierarchy. When life is unpredictable, people accept systems that promise stability, even if the price is obedience. A more cautious explanation could be that hierarchy arises because coordination is efficient. Both can be true depending on which courtyard you are standing in. You pause at a boundary marker, a simple stone or post. It divides space in a way that feels new. This side is sacred. That side is common. This area belongs to the powerful. That one belongs to everyone else. Boundaries are how cities teach you your place. Historians still argue whether the earliest temples primarily served communal needs, or whether they quickly became instruments of elite control with sacred language used to justify inequality. You let that sentence settle in the air like dust, because it holds the theme of tonight's What If? If a society feels like it begins after a disappearance, it might begin with the question who gets to speak for what is gone. The answer often is whoever builds the tallest platform and convinces everyone it is the voice of the heavens. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot look inside every conversation that happened in these courtyards. We cannot hear every skeptical whisper. We cannot see every moment someone decided to comply or resist or simply survive. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You leave the temple compound as the sun slides toward afternoon, and the city feels heavier now, not with doom, just with structure, rules, roles, ritual, the kind of human architecture built to stand where certainty once might have stood. And as you walk away, you keep one small object in your mind as a soft motif for cohesion, the reed stylus, simple and quiet, the tool that turns power into record, record into story, and story into the shape of a world. You follow the river again because rivers are the oldest narrators, and they never stop talking even when nobody writes them down. The city thins as you move outward. Houses become smaller courtyards, rougher, and the air opens up. You can smell wet reeds and sun-warmed silt, and you hear the constant little sounds that water makes when it slides past roots and stones. If you listen long enough, it almost sounds like someone whispering a story you half remember. Most historians agree that ancient flood stories likely draw from real experiences with destructive river floods, especially in regions where seasonal waters can surge unpredictably. Archaeology suggests that some settlements show flood layers in the ground, physical reminders that water sometimes arrives like an uninvited guest who does not respect your furniture. The evidence we do have points to repeated flooding events varying by place and time, shaping both practical engineering and cultural memory. And here your mind naturally wanders into the foggy part of tonight. One interpretation is that when people tell a big flood story, they might be compressing many smaller floods into one unforgettable image. Not a single global event, but a regional reality turned into mythic language. It's possible that a flood becomes the perfect metaphor for a break in continuity. The world before is washed away. The world after has to be rebuilt, but with different rules, different fears, different habits. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the disappearance of the Anunnaki fits into this same human habit. When something important ends, people describe it with water, with departure, with skies closing, with doors shutting. You walk along a levee. It's not huge, but it is deliberate. Packed earth, reed bundles, a little slope reinforced where someone clearly learned the hard way. Most historians agree that early societies in river valleys develop water management strategies, canals, levees, diversion channels because survival depends on it. Archaeology suggests that these systems are built, repaired, expanded, and argued over endlessly because water is both friend and threat. You pass an older man sitting near the path. He has the look of someone who has seen a flood with his own eyes, the kind of gaze that is calm until it suddenly becomes distant. He gestures toward the river and speaks to a younger person beside him. You do not catch the exact words, but you can imagine the story the year the water rose too fast, the night the storage room filled, the day the fields turned into a lake, the time the gods were angry, or the time the gods were absent, or the time humans made a mistake and paid for it. Historians still argue whether major flood myths preserve memory of specific historical floods, or whether they are primarily symbolic stories about order, morality, and cosmic balance. That debate matters because it changes what you are listening for in the water. If flood stories are historical memory, they are like fingerprints in mud. If they are symbolic, they are like dreams shaped by fears and hopes rather than dates. You keep walking and the wind shifts. It brings a coolness that feels like evening arriving early, and for a moment you taste salt in the air, faint like the memory of an ancient sea. Some parts of this region were once different in climate and coastline over long stretches of time, and the evidence we do have points to changing environments influencing where people settle and how they farm. The ground itself is an archive, but it speaks slowly and you have to be gentle with your conclusions. A fringe idea proposes that flood stories hint at something more dramatic. An advanced culture lost, a knowledge system drowned, a world wiped clean to start again. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it flatters the imagination. It lets you picture a hidden chapter, glittering and tragic. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the mainstream view is far more grounded. Floods happen, people suffer, people rebuild, and stories grow. Still, even within mainstream history, a flood can function like a reset button. A city can be abandoned. A population can move. Leadership can change. Traditions can snap and be tied back together with different knots. You reach a small cluster of huts near the riverbank. The people here live closer to the water, which means they live closer to risk. There are nets drying on lines. There are reed mats. There is a smell of fish and smoke. Most historians agree that not everyone in early societies lives in the monumental core. Many people live in modest spaces working the river, the fields, the animals. Archaeology suggests a wide spectrum of living conditions from elite compounds to simple dwellings. A more cautious explanation could be that flood myths spread because everyone understands water's power. You do not need a temple education to know what it means when the river rises. You only need to have lost something once. You crouch and touch the damp earth. It is cool, soft, and it clings to your fingertips. You see tiny bits of plant matter, little traces of life caught in silt. This is where the past hides best. Not in palaces, but in layers. And now, because we promised not to bore you, the scene shifts. You follow a narrow channel where water is guided into fields. The fields are divided like a patchwork quilt, and you can see the logic. Water enters here, drains there, moves in loops that people have learned to control. Most historians agree that irrigation agriculture is a major driver of early complexity in this region. The evidence we do have points to systems that require cooperation and constant maintenance. Here is a soft joke, because even ancient water management deserves one. You think your home plumbing is stressful, but here, one clogged channel can start a neighbourhood argument that lasts longer than some modern marriages. You watch a farmer open a small gate in the channel. Water spills into a field, darkening the soil. The farmer's face relaxes just slightly, like someone hearing good news. This is the quiet triumph of everyday life. Not kings, not myths, just water arriving where it is needed. One interpretation is that floods and irrigation create a cultural obsession with balance. Too little water, you starve. Too much, you drown. So the entire society becomes a negotiation between extremes. That negotiation shows up in religion, in law, in stories. And if a people feel like they are living after a disappearance, after a loss of certainty, then water becomes the perfect symbol. It can erase, it can nourish, it can remake. A popular rumour claims that the great flood stories are warnings left by non-human beings, as if someone wanted to teach humanity a lesson from a vanished age. This is a dramatic idea, and it is not widely accepted, but it fits the human love of imagining messages in disasters. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that flood stories serve social purposes. They teach humility, emphasize morality, justify authority, or simply give people a way to process trauma. The evidence we do have points to myths doing many jobs at once. You walk toward a spot where the river has cut into its bank. The exposed earth shows lines like pages, dark layers, light layers, a thick band of silt. You cannot read it like a book, but you can feel its meaning. Something happened here then. Something happened again and again. Time stacking patient and indifferent. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You stand at the edge of the water and let the story settle into your bones. The river does not explain itself. It does not confirm rumours. It does not care about names like Anunnaki. It simply moves, and humans move with it, building cities, when the water allows losing them when it refuses. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Because even if you accept every mainstream fact about floods and layers and settlement patterns, you still cannot fully recover what it felt like in the exact moment to watch the water rise and realize that the world you knew is ending. You turn back toward the land, toward the fields and paths, carrying the calm awareness that human history often feels like it starts after something disappears. Not because nothing existed before, but because loss sharpens memory. A flood washes away details and leaves a clean, haunting outline. And as you walk, the reeds whisper beside you, and the water keeps talking, and you let it lull you, without demanding it solve the mystery. You leave the river's edge and step into the wide, open honesty of farmland, where the sky feels bigger because there are fewer walls to interrupt it. The ground here is worked organised, coaxed into being useful. Furrows run in steady lines. Small irrigation channels glint like thin mirrors. The air smells like warm soil, crushed leaves, and the faint sweet note of something flowering nearby. If cities are where humans learn to count, fields are where humans learn to wait. Most historians agree that the shift to agriculture begins much earlier than the first true cities, and archaeology suggests farming spreads and intensifies over long stretches of time, with different communities adopting crops and herding in different ways. The evidence we do have points to a gradual, uneven process, not a single invention moment, and certainly not something that happens overnight like a miracle upgrade. But you can still feel a change in tempo here. It's possible that when societies become more urban and complex, agriculture turns into something else. Not just a way to eat, but a way to manage people. A more cautious explanation could be that intensification happens because growing populations need more calories and more stability. Yet one interpretation is that farming also becomes a kind of social contract binding families to land seasons and obligations, making life more predictable and also more controllable. You walk along the edge of a field and watch people work. A man uses a simple plough pulled by an animal that looks mildly offended by the entire concept of labour. A woman scatters seeds with a practiced flick of her wrist. A child carries water in a small jar, moving carefully, trying not to spill like the jar is a tiny universe that must stay intact. The evidence we do have points to the sheer amount of human effort required to make early agriculture reliable. Clearing weeds, repairing channels, protecting crops from animals, storing harvests. The work is repetitive and relentless, and yet it builds the foundation for everything that follows. Most historians agree that surplus food supports specialization cities and long-distance trade, because you cannot have full-time scribes or metalworkers if everyone is chasing dinner. Historians still argue whether agriculture was experienced primarily as progress that improved security or as a trap that increased labour, disease and inequality compared to some earlier lifeways. That debate is not just academic. You can feel it in your own body as you imagine a day in this field. Your back aches, your hands blister, your stomach tightens with hunger if the harvest fails. And yet there is also a steady comfort in knowing that a field, if tended well, can feed a family through winter. You crouch and take a small handful of soil. It is fine, dark, slightly moist. It smells alive. Archaeology suggests early farmers learn the personality of their land, which areas hold water, which drain too fast, which need more silt, which can tolerate salt. Soil is not just dirt. It is a partner with moods. And here is where the cinematic what if slides in like a soft breeze. One interpretation is that after a perceived disappearance of guidance, humans might cling harder to things they can control. The sky is unpredictable. The river is unpredictable. But a field with enough labour can be trained. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, intensifying agriculture could feel like humanity grabbing the steering wheel with both hands, saying, "Fine, we will make our own stability now." A fringe idea proposes that some early agricultural knowledge appears too organised, too systematic, as if it were taught. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations emphasise experimentation, gradual improvement, and knowledge passed through generations. Still, the rumour persists because humans love the thought of a shortcut. The idea that someone somewhere handed us a manual. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence we do have points to long learning curves, setbacks, and regional variation. Farming is rarely elegant at first. It is messy. It is trial and error. It is people planting the wrong thing in the wrong place and learning the hard way. You stand again and follow a small channel. Water moves through it with a quiet, purposeful sound. It enters a field, spreads, then drains away. Most historians agree that irrigation is a key element in making farming productive in arid regions. And archaeology suggests communities invest heavily in water management. These channels are not only engineering, they are social agreements carved into the ground. Here is a gentle joke, because water schedules are basically ancient group chats. You can almost hear the arguments: who gets water first, who stole water last night, who forgot to close a gate and flooded the neighbour's onions. Some things are timeless. You walk past a small herd. Goats, sheep, maybe cattle moving in a dusty cluster, guided by a young herder who carries a stick and looks like he is being given way too much responsibility for his age. Most historians agree that herding is intertwined with early agriculture, providing meat, milk, wool, labour and manure. Archaeology suggests herding strategies adapt to environment and social needs, and that animals become both economic assets and cultural symbols. One interpretation is that domesticating animals changes how humans see power. When you can control breeding movement and behaviour, you may begin to imagine controlling other parts of life the same way. A more cautious explanation could be that herding simply follows from practical needs. But it's possible that this shift contributes to new metaphors in religion and leadership. Shepherds, flocks sacrifices rulers as caretakers or rulers as owners. You pass a low storage pit lined with reeds. Someone is sealing it with clay. Food preservation is a quiet art, and most historians agree it is crucial for survival and for building surplus. The evidence we do have points to storage technology improving over time, and storage changes everything. When you can store grain, you can plan. When you can plan, you can coordinate. When you can coordinate, you can build cities, armies, temples, and yes, taxes. A popular rumour claims that the first farmers were pressured by higher powers to produce surplus, as if someone needed the output. This is dramatic, and it is not widely accepted, but it echoes in fringe storytelling, because it makes human toil feel like part of a cosmic bargain. To be clear, this is debated. A more cautious explanation could be that surplus emerges because communities seek resilience against famine, and because leaders organise labour for communal projects. The evidence we do have points to human motivations that are already strong enough without adding visitors. Hunger is persuasive. Security is persuasive. Social status is persuasive. You walk along the boundary between fields and a small settlement. Here life is quieter than the city core. People repair tools. Children chase each other. A woman shakes grain in a basket, letting chaff drift away in the breeze. The sunlight makes the dust sparkle briefly like tiny stars that are too tired to stay in the sky. And you feel the theme of tonight settle deeper. What if human history started after something disappeared? Not because humans were absent before, but because humans became obsessed with continuity after experiencing rupture. Fields are continuity machines. They turn seasons into expectation. They turn effort into food. They turn uncertainty into routine. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot measure the exact emotional weight of early farming life. We can infer labour, diet, settlement patterns. We can analyse tools and seeds and bones, but we cannot fully hear the private thoughts of a farmer staring at a cloudy sky, wondering if rain will come, wondering if the canal will hold, wondering if the world is still being watched by gods or by nothing at all. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You keep walking until the fields stretch out like a calm ocean of green and gold. The sound of the city fades. The river is a distant murmur. All that remains is the whisper of plants moving in the wind and the slow, steady pulse of human work. And in that pulse, you can almost believe that after any disappearance, real or symbolic, humanity's answer is the same plant. Something tend it wait and tell yourself a story that makes the waiting bearable. You step away from the fields and into a place where the air tastes different, sharper, like it has teeth. The sun is still warm, but here the warmth concentrates around small fires, and those fires change the world in quiet, stubborn increments. You smell charcoal and hot clay. You hear the faint ring of stone on stone, then a softer metallic tap that almost disappears into the wind as if the sound is shy about announcing something new. Most historians agree that early metallurgy develops gradually, with copper used first in many regions before more complex alloys become widespread. Archaeology suggests people begin by collecting native copper and learning that it can be hammered, shaped and polished, then later discovering that heating and smelting can transform certain rocks into workable metal. The evidence we do have points to a long learning curve with experiments, failures and local traditions, not a sudden overnight leap. Still, when you watch it up close, it feels like the first bright edge of a different age. You enter a small workshop where a smith or metalworker tends a fire. The hearth is simple, but the attention given to it is intense. A bellows, perhaps made from leather, pushes air into the coals. The coals brighten. Heat ripples in the air like a mirage. A clay crucible sits nearby, darkened from use. You realize quickly that metal is not only material, metal is time concentrated. It is the hours spent gathering fuel, the careful preparation, the patience of heating and waiting and not blinking at the wrong moment. It is the kind of craft that pulls people towards specialization, because not everyone can spend all day flirting with the fire when there are fields and canals and children and hungry mouths. Historians still argue whether the earliest advances in metallurgy spread primarily through long-distance trade networks, or whether many communities developed techniques independently in response to similar needs and resources. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine knowledge moving. Does it travel like a rumour from mouth to mouth across distances? Does it bloom in multiple places because human curiosity is a common weather pattern? Or does it, in a more dramatic fringe telling, arrive as a gift? A fringe idea proposes that metallurgy is one of those technologies that feels too powerful to be purely human at first, as if someone handed humanity a shortcut to dominance. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations are grounded in experimentation, resource availability, and gradual refinement. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why people love the idea. Fire and metal look like sorcery when you have never seen them. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence we do have points to a slow unfolding. Early metal objects are often small, decorative, or symbolic. Practical tools and weapons come later as production improves, and as metal becomes more accessible. It is not the Hollywood moment of a glowing sword emerging perfectly formed. It is a lot of sweating and squinting and occasionally producing something that looks like a bent spoon with ambition. You watch the metalworker lift a piece of copper. It is dull at first, then brightens when polished. He hammers it on a stone or simple anvil, each strike measured. The metal yields in a way stone does not. It bends instead of shattering. That single fact changes how you build and how you fight and how you imagine the future. Most historians agree that metal tools can improve efficiency in agriculture, woodworking and construction, though stone tools remain common for a long time. The evidence we do have points to mixed toolkits, with communities using whatever works best and whatever they can obtain. You look around the workshop and notice the supporting cast: charcoal makers, clay workers who craft moulds and crucibles, traders who bring ore or finished goods, a scribe who might record transactions. Metal does not exist alone. It pulls a small economy into being around it. Here's a gentle joke, because every new technology deserves one. You think you are watching the dawn of metallurgy, but half the time you are watching someone argue with a fire that refuses to cooperate. The first tech support in history probably just said, "Have you tried blowing on it harder?" You step closer to a shelf where small objects rest. A pin, a hook, a tiny blade. Nothing dramatic yet. Everything feels slightly different in their presence. A blade, even a small one, is a promise. It promises cleaner cuts, faster work, and also sharper conflict if someone decides to use it that way. One interpretation is that metal becomes a new language of status. If only certain people can access metal, then metal becomes a marker of connection, power, and privilege. A more cautious explanation could be that scarcity alone creates prestige. But it's possible that early elites use metal objects as visible proof that they are plugged into something larger: trade routes, temple redistribution, or specialized labor. You leave the workshop and follow a path toward a market area. Here you see metal objects displayed alongside pottery, textiles and food. A trader holds up a copper piece like it is a tiny sun. People gather to look, not only because it is useful, but because it is fascinating. Most historians agree that trade networks expand and become more complex as cities grow. Archaeology suggests materials like copper tin stone shells and luxury goods move across surprising distances, linking communities that never meet face to face. The evidence we do have points to exchange as a major engine of innovation because new materials bring new possibilities. And now the cinematic what-if mood slips into place again. What if after a symbolic disappearance, humans become especially hungry for tools that make them feel less vulnerable? A metal blade feels like control in your hand. A metal hook feels like reliability. A metal pin holds fabric together more securely. Tiny improvements add up, and soon the world feels more manageable. A popular rumour claims that certain early metalworking techniques were guarded as sacred secrets, taught only within temple circles, as if the knowledge itself carried dangerous power. This is plausible in a human way because specialised skills often become protected in hierarchical societies. Still, the details are hard to confirm. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We can infer workshops, slag tools and trade goods. We can analyse metal composition, but we cannot always reconstruct the social rules around who was allowed to know what. We can suggest patterns, not certify them. You walk toward a construction site where workers shape beams and stack bricks. A metal tool flashes briefly in the sun, and you see how it changes the rhythm of work. A cut is cleaner, a notch is quicker, a repair is smoother. Most historians agree that technological shifts often show up in mundane places, first in how quickly a person can do a task, and how precisely they can repeat it. Historians still argue whether early technological change is driven mainly by elite demand and state projects, or by grassroots innovation from craftspeople responding to everyday problems. That debate matters because it changes the emotional tone of invention. Is it top-down, demanded by rulers and temples, or bottom-up, discovered by stubborn hands and practical minds? In truth, it may be both, braided like everything else. You pause near a small pile of slag. It looks like nothing black and lumpy, a waste product. Yet it is a quiet signature of transformation. Stone became metal, fire became tool, waste became proof that something happened here. And the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Because even if you explain metallurgy through mainstream archaeology, there is still something oddly poetic about how humans learn. We take the most ordinary things, rocks, wood, air, and we persuade them into new forms. We build a future by arguing patiently with nature. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You leave the market as the light begins to soften. The city hum shifts again, and you carry with you the memory of that first bright edge, not as a weapon fantasy, but as a small human insistence. If we cannot rely on invisible help, we will make our own help out of fire and stubbornness. And somewhere behind you a bellow sighs, the coals glow, and the world quietly, permanently becomes slightly sharper. You follow sound first, because sound is how trade announces itself. A bell on a donkey, a cartwheel complaining, a vendor calling out in a voice that is half advertisement, half performance. The city's edges blur into roads that are not really roads yet, more like habits pressed into earth by repeated footsteps. You step onto one of those habits and feel the subtle change under your sandals. The ground is harder here, compacted by travel, and it carries the faint smell of faraway places, resin, wall smoke from unknown hearths. Most historians agree that long-distance exchange networks develop early and expand as cities grow, linking communities through shared needs and opportunities. Archaeology suggests that materials not found locally, metals, stones, shells, timber, bitumen, appear in places where they must have been carried or traded. The evidence we do have points to caravans and river transport as practical ways. Goods and ideas move even when travel is slow and uncomfortable. You join a small caravan heading outward. It is not a heroic procession. It is people doing logistics. A few donkeys or pack animals carry bundles. A guard carries a spear, not with drama, but with the bored posture of someone who is mostly here to discourage trouble. A trader walks with the careful eye, scanning the horizon, scanning faces, scanning the mood of the road. Your mouth tastes dry because travel does that. Dust rises with each step. The sun is steady and the wind is gentle enough to feel like it is trying to help but does not know how. You notice the first shared symbols. A mark painted on a bundle. A stamp impressed into a bit of clay sealing a jar. A carved token worn on a string around a trader's neck. These are not full writing in every moment, but they are communication. Most historians agree that early societies developed seals and marks for identity ownership and authentication. Archaeology suggests cylinder seals and stamp seals become important tools for administration and trade, leaving tiny images pressed into clay like miniature signatures. One interpretation is that symbols travel faster than people. A careful reading might suggest that when a sign or seal is recognized across regions, it creates a shared mental map. You may not know the person, but you know the mark. You may not share the language, but you share the image. In a world that feels newly organized, symbols become bridges. And because tonight carries a mist of what if you let a cinematic question float beside you. What if after a symbolic disappearance, humans become especially hungry for shared meaning? What if the road becomes a place where scattered communities stitch themselves back together through repeated signs, repeated rituals of exchange, repeated agreements until a network forms that feels almost alive? Historians still argue whether early trade is primarily driven by practical necessity, securing scarce materials and food, or by social and political ambition elites seeking prestige goods to display power and connection. That debate matters because it changes the emotional colour of the caravan. If this is necessity, then trade is survival. If this is prestige, then trade is theatre. In truth, it can be both, and you can see both in the same bundle, useful metal hidden under decorative shells. You stop at a river crossing. The water is shallow enough to ford in places, and the caravan hesitates because water always demands respect. Someone tests the current with a stick. Someone else jokes that the river looks calm, which is usually the moment a river decides to prove a point. Here's a soft joke, because travel needs humour like bread needs salt. If you ever romanticised ancient trade routes, just remember that half of it is standing around while someone argues with a river. The other half is standing around while someone argues with a donkey. You cross slowly. The water is cool around your ankles. Pebbles shift underfoot. On the far bank, you shake off the wet and feel the dust return almost immediately, like the road missed you. As you walk, you notice how stories move. Travellers talk. They trade gossip as eagerly as goods. News about harvests. News about a new ruler. News about a flood in a far region. News about a strange event in the sky. Most historians agree that information is a form of wealth in early societies, and long-distance travel routes serve as channels, not only for objects, but for ideas. The evidence we do have points to shared motifs in art and myth across regions, suggesting contact and exchange. A fringe idea proposes that shared symbols across distant places hint at a single older source, a lost blueprint that people keep copying without realizing it. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations emphasize diffusion and independent development shaped by trade. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine the network as something that carries more than goods. It carries memory fragments. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And the evidence we do have points to human creativity being both local and contagious. People borrow what works. They adapt what impresses them. They repeat patterns that feel meaningful. Over time, similarities emerge without requiring a single hidden origin. You reach a small way station, not an inn with cozy beds, because please lower your expectations, more like a cluster of shelters and a cleared space where travellers can rest, trade and repair. Fires burn low, someone offers water, someone offers dried food, someone offers a story in exchange for listening, which is an ancient form of entertainment and also a modern one if you think about it. Most historians agree that travel and trade create contact zones where cultures mix. Archaeology suggests that these zones can be found in border regions, river crossings and market hubs, places where foreign goods appear and where artistic styles blend. One interpretation is that contact creates discomfort. When you meet strangers, you are forced to define yourself. You are forced to say, we are this, they are that. Sometimes this leads to curiosity, sometimes it leads to suspicion, often it leads to new identities forming hybrid and flexible. You watch a trader unroll cloth. The cloth is dyed a colour that seems too rich for ordinary life. People gather around, drawn to it. A woman reaches out and touches it, then pulls her hand back quickly, as if she is afraid to stain the fabric with her reality. Here is another gentle joke, because even ancient shoppers deserve one. You can tell the cloth is expensive because everyone touches it like it might bite, and the seller watches like a hawk, which is the oldest retail surveillance system on Earth. A scribe appears. He's not always present on the road, but here at a hub record-keeping returns. He presses marks into clay to note a transaction. A seal is rolled. A mark is made. The moment becomes official. Most historians agree that administration and trade are intertwined, and archaeology suggests seals and tablets are used to track goods, ownership and obligations. A popular rumour claims that traders carried secret knowledge alongside goods, maps of hidden places, stories of ancient ruins, instructions passed quietly between groups. This is not widely accepted as a general rule, but it reflects something true in spirit. Travel exposes you to mysteries. To be clear, this is debated. You cannot assume every traveller is a keeper of secrets. Often they are just tired. Often they are thinking about getting home alive. But it is possible that some routes become pathways for unusual ideas, and those ideas can shape civilizations in ways that are hard to trace. You leave the way station and walk into late afternoon light. Shadows lengthen. The road feels quieter. Your feet ache and you realize again that history is not built by heroes alone. It is built by people who keep walking. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can trace goods through material evidence. We can infer routes. We can see shared symbols. But we cannot fully map the invisible cargo, the jokes told around the fire, the fears whispered at night, the half-remembered myths about beings who left, and the world that had to improvise after they were gone. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You continue along the road until the first stars appear faint at the edge of the sky, and you realize that trade routes are more than lines on land. They are veins. They carry resources, yes, but they also carry the shared human habit of reaching outward, of refusing isolation, of building a world bigger than any one city. And as the caravan's bells fade into the night, you let the sound become a lullaby, steady, repetitive, and strangely comforting, like proof that even in uncertainty, people keep finding each other. Night settles over you like a soft blanket that smells faintly of smoke and dust. The caravan slows, then stops, and you find a spot near a low fire where the heat is gentle, not harsh. Above you, the sky opens in full and without city walls or tall platforms, in the way the stars feel closer. Not closer in distance, of course, but closer in attention. They demand your eyes. Most historians agree that ancient peoples observed the sky carefully for practical reasons: seasons, planting cycles, navigation, and ritual timing. Archaeology suggests that by early historical periods, communities in Mesopotamia and beyond developed sophisticated traditions of sky watching, using repeated observations to build calendars and predict seasonal patterns. The evidence we do have points to a strong link between astronomy, agriculture, and administration, because timekeeping is a form of control and also a form of survival. You lie back on a mat, or maybe just on packed earth, and let your gaze drift upward. The stars do not flicker the way you expect in modern city light. They are sharp, steady points. The Milky Way, if you can see it, looks like pale smoke stretched across darkness. You hear someone nearby speaking quietly, naming shapes in the sky, pointing with a finger that moves slowly, carefully, like the finger itself is part of the ritual. One interpretation is that the sky becomes a shared authority. If the world on the ground feels unstable, if rulers change and floods come and trade, roots shift, the stars feel fixed. They rise, they set, they return. A careful reading might suggest that early calendars are not only tools but comfort. They say time is not random. Time has a pattern. You can plan. You can hope. Historians still argue whether early astronomical knowledge is primarily practical and seasonal, or whether it is deeply entwined with religious and political power, with elites using sky law to legitimize authority. That debate matters because you can see both possibilities at once. A farmer wants to know when to plant. A temple wants to schedule festivals. A ruler wants to claim that his reign is aligned with cosmic order. The same star can serve all three. You watch as someone scratches marks into a small piece of clay or wood. It might be a tally, a simple record of lunar cycles, a note about when a star first appears in the dawn. Most historians agree that lunar calendars and seasonal markers are among the earliest timekeeping systems, and the evidence we do have points to careful observation over long periods, refined into traditions that can be taught. A more cautious explanation could be that sky watching grows naturally when communities depend on seasons and when they have specialists who can dedicate time to observation. Yet it's possible that sky law also becomes a language of awe, a way to translate the vastness above into something human scale. And now the cinematic what if mood drifts in like cool night air. What if after the Anunnaki disappear in story language, humans look upward more intensely, searching for signs that the sky is still listening? What if the first calendars feel like messages sent into silence, not expecting an answer, but needing to send something anyway? A fringe idea proposes that ancient astronomical systems are too precise to be purely observational, suggesting instruction from advanced outsiders. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship emphasizes cumulative observation, record keeping, a mathematical refinement over generations. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can understand why the idea feels tempting. The sky invites big thoughts. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And the evidence we do have points to humans being very good at pattern recognition and very persistent when something matters. If your harvest depends on timing, you will watch the sky with the focus of someone waiting for a very slow notification. Here is a gentle joke delivered like a sleepy aside. The first astronomers basically invented the original calendar app, except their reminders were the entire night sky and their battery never died. You sit up and look toward the horizon. The river is out there somewhere invisible in the dark, but you can hear it if you listen. It is a low murmur. The fire crackles. Someone coughs. A dog sighs dramatically as if it has been asked to carry the emotional weight of the universe. You notice that star stories are not only about time, they are about identity. People name constellations not because the stars demand names, but because humans do. Most historians agree that constellations and star myths vary by culture and reflect local concerns, animals, gods, rulers, and values. The evidence we do have points to a strong relationship between storytelling and observation where imagination attaches to pattern. One interpretation is that constellations are a way to domesticate the sky. You cannot touch it, so you name it. You cannot control it, so you narrate it. You cannot fully understand it, so you weave it into your social world. The sky becomes familiar, less terrifying, more like a companion. A popular rumour claims that certain stars were seen as the pathways of departing beings, or as signs of watchers returning. This is not widely accepted as a literal claim, but it fits the human habit of reading meaning into the heavens, especially when life on the ground is hard. To be clear, this is debated. Ancient people might interpret celestial events as omens, but that does not mean those events are actually messages. A more cautious explanation could be that omens help people make sense of uncertainty and help leaders justify decisions because saying the sky agrees with you is an old political strategy. You watch the moon rise. It is bright enough to cast shadows. It washes the landscape in silver. The fields become quiet shapes. The road becomes a pale line. Most historians agree that lunar cycles are among the easiest natural rhythms to track and often form the backbone of early calendars. The evidence we do have points to months, festivals, and agricultural planning tied to moon phases. Historians still argue whether the earliest calendar systems are standardized mainly for administrative control, taxes, labor schedules, festivals, or for practical seasonal survival needs at the household level. Again, it is probably both. People need to coordinate. People also need to eat. You stand and walk a little away from the campfire, just far enough that the voices soften. Out here alone with the sky, you feel the strange emotional core of this section. The stars do not care about your myths. They do not confirm your theories, but they provide a steady rhythm that can hold a civilization's attention for thousands of years. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can reconstruct some ancient astronomical knowledge from later texts and from patterns of observation, but we cannot fully recover what the sky felt like to someone who believed it was alive with intention. We cannot fully measure the private comforts someone found in counting stars while the world on the ground shifted. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You look up one last time and let your eyes trace a path from one star to another, connecting them with invisible lines. You realize that this too is what humans do after any disappearance. We connect points, we make patterns, we build stories that let us sleep. And as you return to the warmth of the fire, you carry a quiet, steady thought. Even if history feels like it begins after something vanishes, the sky remains. It watches without judgment. It offers rhythm without promise. It becomes the calm ceiling over all human improvisation. Morning arrives softly, not with a trumpet, but with a shift in temperature and a change in the colour of the dust. You wake with your mouth dry and your back mildly offended by the concept of sleeping on earth. The fire is mostly ash now, and someone has already started it again, because humans cannot resist the comfort of warmth and routine. Above you, the sky is pale blue, and the stars have quietly stepped back like stagehands who did their job and do not need applause. You travel again, and by midday, the caravan approaches another hub, a place where the road thickens with footprints, and the air smells like many things at once. Smoke, animals, sweat, spices, wet clay, and that faint metallic note that always means someone is working. There is noise here, layered noise, the kind that makes your brain feel like it is being gently jostled in a crowded room. Most historians agree that as cities and trade expand systems for resolving disputes and organising life become more formal, archaeology suggests early societies develop both customary practices and written rules, moving toward law codes and standardized judgments over time. The evidence we do have points to increasing complexity in property debt, labour obligations, marriage arrangements, and commerce, and complexity tends to demand rules. You step into a public space where people gather. It might be a market square or a courtyard near an administrative building. A line forms, not because people love lines, but because someone has decided that waiting in order is better than fighting. A man argues about a debt. A woman argues about a boundary. Someone complains about a missing goat. Someone else complains about being blamed for the missing goat, which is always the true crime. A scribe sits nearby, tablet ready. His posture is calm, but his role is powerful. When disputes become written, they become harder to escape. Most historians agree that writing supports law and administration by preserving decisions and obligations. The evidence we do have points to written contracts, receipts, and legal records as early forms of a rule-based society. One interpretation is that law is a human attempt to make the world predictable. A more cautious explanation could be that law is also a tool of authority, a way for institutions to standardize control. Both can be true at the same time. A law code can protect the vulnerable in one clause and reinforce hierarchy in another. Historians still argue whether early law codes primarily reflect efforts to reduce conflict and promote fairness, or whether they mainly serve elite interests by formalizing inequality and protecting property and power. That debate lands quietly in your chest, because you can see both possibilities in the faces around you. The poor person hopes the law will protect them. The wealthy person hopes the law will preserve what they have. The official hopes the law will keep the peace. and keep their positions safe. You move closer to listen. A judge or elder speaks. The words are firm. The crowd murmurs. The scribe presses marks into clay. A seal is rolled. The decision becomes a thing that can travel beyond this moment. Most historians agree that written law codes become prominent in certain periods, often linked to state authority, and the evidence we do have points to laws covering theft, property labour, marriage, injury, trade, and debt. The laws often prescribe penalties, sometimes fines, sometimes corporal punishment. But we are keeping this sleep friendly and not leaning into graphic detail. The point is that rules become explicit, and explicit rules change behaviour. Here is a gentle joke, because even ancient law deserves one. You know, a society is getting serious when they start writing down rules about other people's donkeys, because at that point even the donkeys need legal protection. You notice the weight of contracts. Two men stand facing each other with a small object between them, maybe a token, maybe a clay envelope, maybe a sealed tablet. They speak carefully, like each word costs money. Most historians agree that contracts and debt systems are central to early complex economies. Archaeology suggests that interest repayment schedules and obligations are recorded, creating long chains of accountability. One interpretation is that debt becomes a new kind of leash. If you owe grain, you owe labour. If you owe labour, you owe time. If you owe time, you owe a piece of your life. A more cautious explanation could be that credit enables trade and resilience, allowing people to smooth out bad seasons. Again, both can be true. Credit can save you. Credit can trap you. A fringe idea proposes that early law codes preserve echoes of older moral rules, as if they are rewriting something ancient into a human system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations see law codes as evolving from social needs and political authority. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine the law as a replacement for vanished certainty. If the gods are quiet, the tablet speaks. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence we do have points to humans being perfectly capable of inventing rules without supernatural instruction. In fact, humans arguably invent rules the way spiders invent webs, instinctively, constantly, and sometimes in places nobody asked for. You walk past a row of merchants. They are weighing goods. A scale tilts. Stones or weights are placed. The balance steadies. Most historians agree that standardization of weights and measures becomes important in trade and administration. The evidence we do have points to systems of measurement that allow transactions to be trusted beyond personal relationships. One interpretation is that measurement is the quiet backbone of civilization. If you can measure, you can plan. If you can plan, you can control. Measurement turns messy life into something that can be accounted for. It also turns people into numbers sometimes, which is the colder side of the same skill. A popular rumour claims that certain ancient measures were derived from cosmic patterns, as if rulers wanted to align their cities with the heavens. This is not widely accepted as a universal truth, but it reflects a real tendency. Societies often connect measurement to sacred order because it makes the system feel more legitimate. To be clear, this is debated. Some measures may arise from practical needs, like counting grain, or dividing land. Others may be wrapped in ritual meaning later. The evidence we do have points to both practicality and symbolism coexisting. You pause near a wall where a public notice might be posted. Not everyone can read, of course. Literacy is limited in many early societies. Most historians agree that scribes form a specialized class trained and valued. The evidence we do have points to education systems for scribes with practiced texts and repeated copying. Here's another gentle joke, because scribal life deserves sympathy. Imagine spending years mastering the art of tiny wedges only to be asked to record somebody's complaint about a stolen goat. That is prestige, apparently. You watch a young apprentice scribe practice. His brow is furrowed. He presses too hard, smears the clay size, then tries again. This is how culture reproduces itself through repetition, through training, through small hands, learning to make the world official. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can read some laws. We can infer social structures. But we cannot fully see how ordinary people felt about living under written rules. Did they feel safer? Did they feel trapped? Did they feel both on the same day? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You step away from the public space and into a quieter lane, where the noise fades into a low hum. The sun is warm. A breeze moves dust along the ground in little spirals, and you carry with you a calm thought. Law is one of humanity's loudest answers to uncertainty. If the world feels like it begins after something disappears, then law is a way of saying, fine, we will build our own order and we will carve it into clay, so it cannot drift away. You walk on and the city continues its busy breathing behind you, while the idea of order settles into your mind like a stone placed carefully in a pocket. The road carries you into a landscape where power stretches farther than one city's walls. You can feel it before you see it, in the way travellers speak more softly, in the way certain guards stand straighter, in the way signs and seals appear more often, as if the land itself is being labelled. The air is drier here, and the horizon feels wider, a reminder that when people begin to organise large territories, they also begin to organise fear. Most historians agree that early states and empires rise through a mix of economic strength, military capability, diplomacy, and administrative innovation. Archaeology suggests that as some city-states gain advantages, control over resources, strategic location leadership, or military organisation, they can expand influence over neighbours. The evidence we do have points to cycles, growth, consolidation, strain, and sometimes collapse, because human systems are powerful but rarely stable forever. You enter a place that feels like an administrative frontier. There is a checkpoint or gate where guards question travellers, not cruelly, just firmly, with the tired professionalism of people who have asked the same questions all day. Who are you? Where are you going? What are you carrying? Are you here to trade? Are you here to cause trouble? Please do not cause trouble. We already have enough. A scribe sits nearby. Of course, most historians agree that bureaucracy expands with territorial control. The evidence we do have points to record keeping taxation, labour levies, and standardised procedures, because you cannot run an empire on vibes alone. Someone has to track grain, someone has to track soldiers, Someone has to track who owes what. One interpretation is that empire is a response to vulnerability. A more cautious explanation could be that empire is driven by ambition and competition among elites. Still, it's possible that when life feels uncertain, states expand to secure resources, buffer zones, and predictable flows of goods. Expansion can look like strength, but it can also be a sign of anxiety. You build outward because you do not trust the world to leave you alone. Historians still argue whether the primary engine of early imperial expansion is military conquest and coercion, or whether it is economic integration and negotiated influence with many communities cooperating because the system offers stability. That debate matters because it changes the emotional texture of what you see. If conquest is dominant, the empire feels like a fist. If integration is dominant, it feels like a net. In reality, it can be both, depending on where you stand and who is asking you for taxes. You travel through a chain of settlements. Each one looks slightly more standardized than the last. Similar weights in markets, similar seals on jars, similar official language used by administrators. Most historians agree that standardization is a hallmark of state power. The evidence we do have points to shared systems that make long-distance governance possible, even if imperfectly. You stop at a way station where a local official collects a portion of goods. He does it calmly, with the confidence of someone backed by a larger system. A merchant sighs and hands over the required amount. The merchant does not love it, but the merchant also likes roads that are safer and markets that are stable. This is the bargain. Here is a gentle joke, because taxes are the most timeless human invention. You can tell you're inside a serious empire because suddenly everyone is inventing creative reasons why their goods are definitely not taxable. The official has heard them all. You move on and the land shifts again. Fields become patchier. Water channels look less maintained in places. You see signs of strain, a collapsed wall, not yet repaired a storage area with fewer goods, a market that feels quieter. The evidence we do have points to empires experiencing stress from climate shifts, resource depletion, internal conflict, external pressure, and administrative burdens. Most historians agree that collapse is rarely one cause. It is usually a bundle of problems arriving at the same time, like bad news in a stack. One interpretation is that collapse feels like abandonment. When a large system fails, people often describe it as the gods leaving or the world losing its order. If you carry the theme of disappearance as story language, then imperial collapse becomes another version of it. A great structure goes quiet. Roads become less safe. Officials stop showing up. The predictable turns unpredictable again. A fringe idea proposes that some collapses are linked to hidden catastrophes, secrets suppressed, forbidden knowledge mishandled. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations focus on documented patterns of environmental stress, political fragmentation, and economic disruption. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why the idea persists. People want collapses to have a single dramatic cause because that feels easier to understand than 1,000 small cracks. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence we do have points to complex systems failing when multiple pressures overlap. Sometimes drought reduces harvests. Sometimes trade networks falter. Sometimes elites fight. Sometimes external groups exploit weakness. Often it is all of the above. You arrive at a city whose outer areas feel neglected. The central buildings still stand, but there are fewer workers moving with purpose. A workshop is quiet. A canal gate is jammed. A man sits in the shade staring at nothing like his mind is too tired to keep solving problems. Most historians agree that periods of decline can show up as reduced monumental building, fewer long-distance luxury goods, and shifts in settlement patterns. Archaeology suggests populations may shrink, or reorganize into smaller units. The evidence we do have points to adaptation as much as collapse. People rarely vanish. They adjust. One interpretation is that after collapse, culture gets rewritten. Not erased, rewritten. Old stories become new warnings. Old rituals become smaller and more local. Authority fragments. Memory becomes contested. The world feels like it begins again because people have to renegotiate how to live. Historians still argue whether so-called collapses should be framed mainly as catastrophic endings or as transformations in which societies reorganize and continue in new forms. That debate is soothing, in a way, because it reminds you that human history is not a series of on-off switches. It is more like weather. Storms pass, patterns shift, people rebuild. A popular rumour claims that some ancient collapses coincide with a sudden silence in the heavens, fewer omens, fewer signs, fewer miracles, as if the sky turned away. This is not a mainstream conclusion, but it captures the feeling people often describe when their world breaks. To be clear, this is debated. The sky does not change because an empire falls, but human interpretation of the sky can change dramatically. When life is stable, omens feel like entertainment. When life is unstable, omens feel like survival. You walk through a partially abandoned street. We keep it calm. No graphic scenes. Just quiet. A door hanging open. A broken pot. A weed growing where a courtyard used to be swept daily. The absence is what speaks. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can measure trade decline. We can analyse climate proxies. We can interpret settlement patterns. But we cannot fully recover the intimate feelings of living through imperial unravelling. The moment you realise the rules are fading, the moment you realise the road is not safe, the moment you realise the old order is no longer coming to help. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You leave the city as evening approaches, and the horizon glows softly. The wind cools. The world feels quieter, and you sense the deep rhythm of history. Expansion, strain, collapse, reorganization. If the story begins after disappearance, then perhaps it begins many times. Every time a system falls silent, people step forward into the open space and start building again. And you keep walking, carrying the gentle thought that even the biggest empires are still made of ordinary days, and ordinary days are fragile. The landscape changes slowly as you move westward and southward in your imagination, not by teleportation, but by the steady logic of travel. Dust becomes sandier. The air grows drier in the day, cooler at night. The horizon feels flatter in some directions, then suddenly rises in others when limestone cliffs appear like the edges of a giant pale book. You reach a river again, but this one has a different personality. It is long patient, and it carries a green ribbon of life through a wider desert. You smell damp soil and river plants, and the water moves with a calm authority that feels older than any dynasty. Most historians agree that the ancient Egyptian state forms over time through complex local developments, including population growth, agricultural productivity, political consolidation, and religious institutions. Archaeology suggests that communities along the Nile gradually integrate into larger political units, eventually forming a centralized kingdom with enduring administrative systems. The evidence we do have points to deep local roots, not a sudden external insertion. And yet, when you stand near the edge of the Nile, you understand why Egypt feels like a world apart. The river floods predictably in many periods. The fields drink, the land renews. That relative regularity compared to more erratic river systems shapes a different kind of stability. Most historians agree that the Nile's flood cycle is foundational for Egyptian agriculture and state formation, even though it can vary and does not always behave perfectly. One interpretation is that stability encourages monumentality. If you can count on a rhythm you can plan across generations, you can build not only for today, but for the idea of forever. A more cautious explanation could be that monumentality emerges because elites organize labor and resources to display power and reinforce ideology. Still, it's possible that the steady river invites humans to think in longer sentences. You approach a construction site. The sun is bright. The stone reflects light into your eyes. Workers move in coordinated lines, hauling blocks, smoothing surfaces, measuring angles. The work is exhausting, but it is also methodical. Most historians agree that ancient Egypt's large monuments require sophisticated organization, skilled labor, and administrative capacity. Archaeology suggests these projects rely on seasonal labor patterns, resource mobilization, and specialist knowledge. You hear the scrape of stone tools, the thud of wood, the murmur of instructions. You smell sweat and wet rope. A foreman gestures with a stick, tracing a line in the dust, showing where something must go. Here is a gentle joke, because even monumental projects have ordinary moments. If you think your job has deadlines, imagine being the person who tells thousands of workers, yes, the afterlife is real, and also please carry that rock a little more to the left. You notice the obsession with alignment. Lines are straight, angles are deliberate, measurements repeat. Most historians agree that Egyptian builders use careful surveying and planning methods. The evidence we do have points to skilled craftsmanship and mathematical understanding applied in practical ways. A fringe idea proposes that such precision indicates outside instruction, a hidden inheritance, or lost advanced techniques. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream explanations emphasize human ingenuity, accumulated skill, and institutional organization. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why the idea appeals. Precision looks like mystery from a distance. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence we do have points to many gradual steps, learning from smaller projects, refining tools, training specialists, developing administrative coordination. Humans can achieve astonishing precision when motivated and organised. You walk toward a temple complex. The air smells of incense and stone warmed by sun. Carvings line walls depicting gods, pharaohs, offerings, and orderly scenes of life and death. Most historians agree that religion and kingship are deeply intertwined in ancient Egypt, with the pharaoh positioned as a key mediator between humans and the divine. Archaeology suggests temples serve as religious centres and economic institutions managing land, labour and resources. One interpretation is that monumental religion is a technology of continuity. If the world feels fragile, you build permanence into stone. If leadership must last beyond a person, you wrap it in cosmic narrative. A more cautious explanation could be that temples and tombs reinforce social hierarchy and legitimize power through spectacle and ritual. Again, both can be true. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of Egypt's monumental building is sincere religious worldview shared broadly or elite political strategy using religion to secure obedience and concentrate resources. That debate matters because you can sense both sincerity and strategy in the air. A worker may believe in the gods. A priest may believe too. A ruler may believe and also enjoy the benefits. You move to a quieter place where scribes work. Papyrus, ink, reeds, careful hands. The smell is different from clay tablet rooms. It is drier plant-based. The writing flows in lines rather than impressions. Most historians agree that writing in Egypt develops along its own path with hieroglyphic and hieratic forms, used for administration, religion and culture. The evidence we do have points to literacy as specialised with scribes trained and valued. And one interpretation is that writing becomes a bridge between mortal time and monumental time. A carved inscription can last centuries. A papyrus can travel and be copied. The written word supports the idea that the state and the cosmos are ordered. A popular rumour claims that Egypt's earliest kings inherited secret knowledge from beings who left long ago, and that pyramids and temples are coded records of that inheritance. This is not widely accepted, but it shows up often in modern imagination because Egypt feels like a riddle carved into stone. To be clear, this is debated. Mainstream scholarship emphasises local cultural development, political consolidation, and practical engineering. Still, if we treat the rumour as a story about human psychology, it makes sense. When you face something enormous and ancient, you want the explanation to be equally enormous. You step outside into late afternoon light. The stone glows softly. Shadows stretch. The river glints in the distance. You can hear birds and distant voices. A boat moves along the water, slow and steady, like time itself is rowing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can study monuments, inscriptions, settlement patterns, and material culture, but we cannot fully recover the inner feeling of living in a society that thinks in eternal cycles. We cannot fully know how it felt to believe that the state is part of cosmic balance, and that your labour on a monument helps keep the world from falling apart. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You walk along the river bank and let the Nile's calm rhythm settle your breath. If tonight's theme is that history begins after disappearance, then Egypt offers a different twist, a civilization that seems to answer uncertainty by insisting on permanence, by building so solidly that even rumours cannot resist attaching themselves to the stone. And as the sun lowers, you realise the monuments are not only about gods or kings, they are also about the human fear of being forgotten and the human determination to leave a mark that does not wash away. You walk into a world that feels connected in a way that surprises you, like the ancient landscape has quietly built its own version of an international web. The air near the coast smells of salt and tar, rope creaks, wood groans. Somewhere a sail snaps once in the wind, like a small impatient clap. You stand on a shoreline where ships come and go, not as rare wonders, but as part of a repeating schedule that keeps distant places in conversation. Most historians agree that the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean becomes deeply interconnected through trade diplomacy and shared elite culture. Archaeology suggests goods move across long distances: copper, tin, ivory, glass, oils, textiles, and finished luxury items. And the evidence we do have points to a network that links palaces, ports, and workshops into something that almost behaves like a single system. You watch a ship being unloaded. Amphorae are carried carefully. Bundles are counted. Seals are checked. A scribe records what arrives because in a connected world, trust often comes with paperwork. The dockside noise is layered gulls, footsteps, shouted instructions, and the dull thump of cargo meeting ground. You taste the faint bitterness of smoke, carried from a cook fire nearby, mixed with the metallic smell of wet nails and the sweet note of resin. One interpretation is that the network creates a new kind of confidence. If you can rely on trade, you can specialize. If you can specialize, you can build wealth. If you can build wealth, you can build palaces, sponsor temples, fund armies, and host feasts that make power feel effortless. A more cautious explanation could be that this confidence is fragile from the start, because the more connected you become, the more you depend on distant stability you cannot control. You step into a storeroom near the harbour. The space is cooler shaded and it smells like grain and oil. Rows of jars sit like quiet soldiers. There are labels or marks that tell you where something came from and who it belongs to. Most historians agree that palace economies and elite institutions play a major role in organising production and distribution in many late Bronze Age societies. The evidence we do have points to centralised control over certain resources, especially luxury goods and strategic materials. Here is a gentle joke tucked into the dim storeroom. You can tell this is a serious international system because somebody has invented the ancient version of inventory management, and somebody else is already pretending the missing jars were definitely never here. You walk through a courtyard where an official receives a visitor. The visitor's clothing looks foreign in small ways, different weave, different colours, different jewellery shapes. They exchange gifts with solemn care. A beautiful object is presented. A polite speech is given. A scribal note is made. Most historians agree that diplomacy in this era often includes gift exchange and formal correspondence among rulers and elites. The evidence we do have points to relationships maintained through letters and emissaries, with language that mixes politeness with quiet pressure. One interpretation is that diplomacy is theatre with consequences. Everyone smiles. Everyone praises. Everyone calls everyone else brother. Meanwhile, everyone watches supply routes, border regions, and the flow of metals. A more cautious explanation could be that diplomacy genuinely reduces conflict and keeps trade flowing. Both can be true, and your sleepy mind notices how familiar it feels. Here is a second gentle joke, because international relations always deserve one. Somewhere a king is sending a gold cup and a polite note that basically says, "You are my dear friend, now please do not block my shipping lane." You move toward a workshop district. Heat rolls out of doorways. Hammers tap. Glass or metal glints. Most historians agree that specialized craft production flourishes in connected systems because raw materials and finished goods can move, and skilled labor can be supported by surplus. Archaeology suggests workshops produce items for both local use and elite exchange, and the evidence we do have points to artisans whose work travels farther than they ever will. You pause beside a metal worker who is shaping something small. It might be a fitting for a weapon, or a tool, or a decorative piece, but the key is the material, bronze. Most historians agree that bronze production depends on copper and tin is often scarce in many regions, so long-distance trade becomes crucial. The evidence we do have points to supply chains that stretch far, and the moment you realise that the whole system feels both impressive and slightly nervous. One interpretation is that the system's strength is also its weakness. If you depend on tin arriving from far away, then a disruption on one route can ripple outward. If you depend on palaces to organise distribution, then palace instability can cascade. A more cautious explanation could be that societies adapt with substitutions, stockpiles, and local solutions, but adaptation takes time, and time is not always available. Historians still argue whether the so-called late Bronze Age collapse is driven mainly by external invasion and raiding, or by internal social upheaval and political fragmentation, or by environmental stress, like drought, with many scholars suggesting a combination rather than a single cause. You feel that sentence settle like a stone in your palm, because now the world around you begins to show subtle signs of strain. Not dramatic at first, just small changes, a harbour that feels quieter, a merchant who complains that a shipment is late, an official who looks more tense than proud, a storeroom shelf with more empty spaces than it should have. Most historians agree that around the end of the late Bronze Age, many major centres in the Eastern Mediterranean experienced disruption, decline, or destruction, and the evidence we do have points to widespread upheaval across multiple regions. Archaeology suggests some sites are abandoned, some are rebuilt smaller, some show signs of sudden disruption, and the pattern looks like a system losing its coordination. You stand on a hill above a town and look out. Smoke rises in the distance, but it could be normal hearth smoke, it could be something else, and you do not rush to conclusions. The wind carries fragments of conversation. People speak of unrest. People speak of shortages. People speak of groups moving along the coast. People speak of alliances shifting. Most historians agree that population movements and conflict can accompany periods of instability, but the exact details are complex and debated. A fringe idea proposes that a single dramatic event triggers the broader collapse, a massive earthquake sequence, a rare celestial event, a mysterious technological shock. This theory isn't widely accepted as a complete explanation, and mainstream views emphasize multiple stressors piling up. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea captures the human craving for a clean narrative. One moment, then everything changes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence we do have points to systems failing when they are overextended and when multiple pressures overlap. Climate shifts can reduce harvests. Political disputes can weaken coordination. Trade disruptions can break supply chains. Conflict can accelerate fear. None of these alone has to be the whole story, but together they can push a connected world past its balance point. You walk through a market that feels thinner, fewer stalls, less variety, people bargaining harder. A vendor who used to sell bright imported goods now offers plain local items and an apologetic shrug. This is not a dramatic collapse scene. It is the slow, ordinary face of instability. Fewer options, more tension, more waiting. Here is a third gentle joke, because even when systems wobble, humans still cope with humour. You know the world is changing when the most exciting import is not luxury glass, but a rumour that someone somewhere still has enough tin to make a decent hinge. You pass a small shrine where offerings are set out. People ask for protection for rain, for safe travel, for stability. Most historians agree that religious practice often intensifies during uncertain times, and the evidence we do have points to rituals and prayers as ways communities process stress. One interpretation is that when a system breaks, it feels like the gods have gone quiet. If you carry the soft, cinematic premise that history begins after disappearance, this is one of those moments where people might describe their world that way. Not because a specific being leaves in a literal sense, but because the dependable structure of life vanishes. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot fully reconstruct every decision that led to failure. We can study ruins, letters, layers, and patterns, but we cannot hear every private fear in the night. We cannot measure the exact moment someone realized the network they depended on might not come back. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You stand near the water again, listening to waves tap the shore in a steady rhythm that does not care about politics. And you feel the quiet lesson of connected worlds. They create wealth and wonder, then they demand maintenance, then they punish complacency. When the links weaken, everyone feels it, from the palace to the dock worker, from the scribe to the farmer waiting for a late shipment that never arrives. You wake in a world that is still there, still breathing, but rearranged. The air feels a little thinner, not in oxygen, but in certainty. The roads are quieter. The big palaces that once held the network together are less present in the daily rhythm, either diminished or far away, like names people avoid saying too loudly. You travel inland where hills rise and the soil changes underfoot, and you find communities that look more self-reliant, more locally focused, as if the world has learned to keep its promises smaller. Most historians agree that after the late Bronze Age disruptions, many regions experienced political fragmentation and cultural shifts, while new powers and new forms of organisation emerge. Archaeology suggests that people do not simply vanish. They adapt, relocate, rebuild, and reframe life around different scales of authority. The evidence we do have points to continuity mixed with change, which is the most honest kind of historical outcome. You enter a village where iron is being worked, not with flashy drama, but with the stubborn practicality of a craft that wants to exist. The workshop is smoky. The heat is hotter than you expect. A bloom of iron is being hammered, and sparks jump like tiny insects. Most historians agree that ironworking spreads over time and becomes increasingly important, though the pace and pathways vary by region. Archaeology suggests that early iron is not instantly superior in all ways. It becomes transformative as production methods improve and as iron becomes more available than bronze in many areas. One interpretation is that iron democratizes power. Bronze depends on long-distance supply of copper and tin. Iron, while still requiring skill and fuel, can often be sourced more locally. A more cautious explanation could be that early iron production is difficult and initially limited, but it's possible that over time the wider availability of iron changes. Who can arm themselves, who can farm efficiently, who can build tools without relying on distant trade routes. Historians still argue whether the rise of iron is primarily a technological breakthrough that drives social change, or whether it spreads mainly because political and trade disruptions make bronze harder to obtain, forcing communities to innovate. That debate matters because it changes what iron feels like in your hands. If it is breakthrough, it feels like progress. If it is necessity, it feels like survival. Either way, it becomes a new chapter written in sparks and sweat. You watch a smith quench a piece of iron in water. The hiss is sharp. Steam rises. The metal darkens. The smith's face is calm focused. This is the human talent for making hard things useful, and it is also the human talent for making useful things dangerous depending on who holds them. Here's a gentle joke, because even the Iron Age deserves a little softness. You know you're in a new era when someone confidently says, "This will definitely be stronger than bronze," and everyone nods while secretly hoping it does not snap during the first real test. You walk through a field where tools look different. A plough tip is iron. A sickle has an iron edge. The work feels slightly more efficient, slightly more reliable. Most historians agree that better tools can increase productivity, though the change is gradual and uneven. Archaeology suggests mixed toolkits remain common for long periods, and the evidence we do have points to gradual adoption shaped by local resources and social networks. One interpretation is that new tools rewrite old stories. When technology changes, people often reinterpret the past. They tell stories that make the present feel inevitable. A careful reading might suggest that myths become a way to explain why the old world fell and the new one rose. Heroes appear, monsters appear, lost golden ages appear, disappearances become moral lessons. A fringe idea proposes that certain myths about gods leaving heroes, arriving, or sacred knowledge being stolen preserve coded memories of real transitions like the collapse of palace systems and the rise of new local powers. This theory isn't widely accepted as a precise decoding method, but it captures something plausible. Myths often hold emotional truth, even when details are uncertain. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence we do have points to myths evolving over time, shaped by politics, identity, and storytelling tradition. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why a community might frame change as a departure and a return, a loss and a recovery. You enter a fortified hilltop settlement. The view is wide, the walls are practical, the gates are narrow, there is less monumental display and more defensive geometry. Most historians agree that in some regions, periods of instability encourage fortified settlements and local power centres. Archaeology suggests hilltops and defensible positions become attractive, and the evidence we do have points to communities prioritising security when broader networks weaken. Historians still argue whether the shift toward local fortification is driven mainly by increased external threat and raiding, or by internal social competition and the breakdown of centralised authority. You can feel the tension in the design. The walls are not built for beauty, they are built for a future problem. A popular rumour claims that people in this era begin to speak about the old gods as if they left, and about new gods as if they arrived, mirroring social change in divine language. This is not a universal fact, but it is a recurring pattern across many cultures. When power shifts, divine stories shift too. To be clear, this is debated. Religious evolution is complex and local. Some traditions persist, some merge, some are reinterpreted. The evidence we do have points to continuity as well as in innovation. You walk into a small shrine. It is modest compared to earlier monumental temples, but it is active. Someone lights incense. Someone pours a small offering. Someone whispers a request for protection. The atmosphere is intimate. You can feel how religion becomes local comfort rather than state spectacle, at least in some places. One interpretation is that intimacy replaces grandeur when certainty breaks. If the old system felt like a huge machine, then the new life feels like smaller gears closer to the hand. A more cautious explanation could be that resources are reduced and institutions are less centralized, so worship becomes smaller by necessity. Still, it's possible that people prefer the smaller scale because it feels more honest. You continue toward a market that is simpler, fewer imported luxuries, more local crafts, more barter and personal trust. Most historians agree that trade does not vanish, but patterns change, and archaeology suggests long-distance exchange may contract in some periods while regional trade continues. The evidence we do have points to adaptation rather than emptiness. Here's another gentle joke, because markets always find a way. The luxury item of the day is not some exotic glass bead. It is a reliable hinge, and everyone treats it like it has its own fan club. You sit near a fire at dusk and listen to stories. They are not written down in this moment. They are spoken, shaped shaped by the teller's voice and the audience's mood. The stories speak of a past that was bigger, a time when the world felt connected and guided. They speak of changes that came like weather. They speak of a time when something left and people had to learn to stand without it. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can study tool changes, settlement shifts, and material patterns, but we cannot fully hear the private meaning people attach to those shifts. We cannot fully know whether someone looked at a new iron blade and thought progress, or whether they thought this is what we had to learn because the old world failed us. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. As the fire burns low, you feel the gentle pulse of a new age forming. Not a clean break, not a perfect restart, but a reweaving. And if history begins after disappearance in story language, then perhaps this is how it begins, with smaller communities, new tools, new myths, and a quiet determination to make life work again, even when the old scripts no longer fit. You travel forward through landscapes that keep changing their accents. Hills become plains, plains become valleys, cities rise again, not as copies of what came before, but as new answers to old human needs. The air in the street smells of oil lamps and bread, and the noise is familiar in any era: vendors calling children running, someone arguing about the price of something that is definitely not worth that much, and someone else paying anyway because they are tired. Most historians agree that as societies stabilize and expand again in different regions, writing systems multiply and diversify, and texts begin to shape identity more explicitly. Archaeology suggests that literacy remains specialized in many places, but written traditions influence law, religion, administration, and memory. The evidence we do have points to scripts and scriptures becoming tools that define who belongs, what is sacred, and how the past should be understood. You step into a room lit by lamplight. The light is warm and low, making shadows soft. A scribe or scholar sits with a writing surface, maybe clay, maybe papyrus, maybe parchment. Depending on the place and period, you are passing through in this wide historical sweep. The hand moves steadily. The smell of ink is sharp and slightly sweet. The quiet feels deliberate, like the room itself is practicing patience. One interpretation is that writing becomes a second kind of architecture. Cities shape bodies. Texts shape minds. A more cautious explanation could be that texts simply record what people already believe, but it's possible that once a story is written, it becomes harder to change and therefore more powerful. A written origin story can turn into identity. A written law can turn into habit. A written prayer can turn into comfort that travels. Historians still argue whether the rise of scripture and formalized tradition reflects primarily grassroots spiritual development or elite efforts to standardize belief and strengthen social control. That debate matters because you can see both impulses on the page. Some lines feel intimate, like someone whispering to the unseen. Other lines feel official, like someone stamping the universe with a seal. You walk through a public space where a text is being read aloud. Most people cannot read the words themselves, but they can hear them. The reader's voice is steady. The crowd listens. Some nod. Some look skeptical. Some look relieved, as if the words are a rope thrown across uncertainty. Most historians agree that oral performance remains central even in literate societies, and the evidence we do have points to texts being experienced through hearing as much as through private reading. One interpretation is that written words become communal memory. Instead of many versions of a story drifting across generations, a text anchors the narrative. A more cautious explanation could be that multiple versions still exist and compete, but it's possible that written forms gain prestige and authority, reshaping which voices are considered legitimate. A popular rumour claims that sacred texts preserve hints of older knowledge, fragments of a vanished era, encoded in symbolic language. This theory isn't widely accepted as a literal decoding scheme, but it reflects a real phenomenon. Texts often preserve older layers of tradition, reinterpreted and repurposed. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence we do have points to texts evolving through transmission, editing, translation and reinterpretation. Older motifs can survive inside new frameworks without implying a hidden non-human author. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine people sensing an echo in familiar phrases, as if language itself carries fossils. You walk into a library-like space, not a modern library with quiet signs and comfy chairs, but a storage room for texts, tablets, scrolls, records. It smells like dust oil and dried plant fibres. The shelves are simple, but the contents feel heavy with time. Most historians agree that record-keeping institutions develop in many civilizations, supporting administration and scholarship. The evidence we do have points to archives as crucial for state continuity and cultural memory. Here's a gentle joke, because archives are the ancient version of your computer folders. Somewhere a scribe has created the first filing system, and somewhere else a different scribe has already lost something important and is blaming the apprentice. You notice something else: competing texts, competing interpretations, competing claims about origins and authority. Most historians agree that societies often contain multiple religious and philosophical traditions, and the evidence we do have points to debates over meaning, ritual, and legitimacy. Texts become battlegrounds not only of ideas, but of power. One interpretation is that disagreement is inevitable where memory becomes formal. When stories are oral, disagreement can be smoothed by performance and flexibility. When stories are written, disagreement hardens into lines. People point at the same sentence and claim opposite meanings. A more cautious explanation could be that oral traditions also contain conflict, but it's possible that writing amplifies it by preserving and circulating exact wording. A fringe idea proposes that the most intense debates arise because people are reacting to something half-remembered, like a cultural scar that texts keep touching. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it can function as a metaphor. When societies go through disruption, they often build narratives that help them explain it, and then they defend those narratives fiercely. To be clear, this is debated. Mainstream history does not require a vanished non-human presence to explain why humans argue about origins and meaning. Humans do that naturally with or without cosmic prompts. You leave the archive and walk into a street where teachers instruct students. A child traces letters in dust. An older student copies a line repeatedly until it looks right. The teacher corrects posture, hand angle, stroke order. Most historians agree that education systems for scribes and scholars exist in many civilizations, and the evidence we do have points to formal training, practice texts, and institutional learning. One interpretation is that schooling is civilization teaching itself how to persist. A more cautious explanation could be that schooling also trains obedience and standardizes thought. Again, both can be true. A student learns beauty in a script. The same student learns which ideas are safe to say aloud. Here's another gentle joke, because students are students across time. The first student to complain about homework probably did it on a clay tablet, which means their complaint has a decent chance of lasting longer than their grades. You reach a quiet courtyard at dusk. Someone reads a text aloud to a small group, not as an official decree, but as comfort. The listeners lean in. Their faces soften. In that moment, you see the tender side of written tradition. It can carry hope across generations. And now the cinematic what-if mood returns soft and careful. What if the feeling that history starts after disappearance is actually the feeling that texts create? Once you write down an origin story, everything before it becomes mist. Everything after it becomes the official timeline. The past that is unwritten feels less real, not because it was, but because it is harder to hold. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can read many ancient texts. We can analyze their layers and contexts, but we cannot fully recover the unwritten worlds that existed alongside them. The stories told in kitchens, on roads, in fields that never became scripture or record. We cannot fully know how many histories were quietly lost, because they were never written or because they were written and later destroyed. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You sit in the courtyard and listen to the reader's voice fade into the evening. The words hang in the air for a moment, then settle into silence, and you feel the strange power of writing. It can preserve, it can define, it can comfort, and it can also create the illusion that the story begins exactly where the ink begins. You drift into the modern world without any sharp jump, the way you drift from one dream into the next. And you realize that the ground under your feet has been doing the same thing all along. Layers. Quiet layers. A street becomes a ruin becomes a trench becomes a museum drawer becomes a headline about a new discovery that is both exciting and, if you are honest, slightly confusing. Most historians agree that archaeology is a slow, careful science built on stratigraphy, context, and cautious interpretation. The evidence we do have points to human history, stretching far beyond writing, far beyond cities, far beyond the neat beginnings people like to imagine. Archaeology suggests that what survives is always partial stone, outlasts wood, clay outlasts cloth, and disasters sometimes preserve what ordinary life would have erased. In other words, the past is not missing because it did not exist, but because it did not always leave durable footprints. You stand at a dig site in your mind, the kind you might visit on a documentary day or a museum trip where the sun is bright and the tools are small and patient, Trowels scrape, brushes flick dust away. The smell is dry earth and sunscreen, and someone is always holding a clipboard like it is a sacred object. A square is marked with string. Each bucket of soil is recorded. Each shard is labelled. One interpretation is that archaeology is our modern replacement for ancient myth. Not in the sense that it is untrue, but in the sense that it is how we now try to answer the same human hunger. Where did we come from? What happened? And why does the story feel like it starts where the record begins? A more cautious explanation could be that archaeology simply reconstructs past lifeways through material evidence, but it's possible that the emotional effect is similar to myth. It gives shape to the unknown. It gives us beginnings and middles and endings, even when the real past is messy. Historians still argue whether the strongest driver of archaeological interpretation is the evidence itself or the questions each generation asks, shaped by modern culture, politics and imagination. That debate matters because you can see it in the way people talk about the past. Some want a clean timeline. Some want a dramatic revelation. Some want a comforting story. Some want the truth, even if it is complicated and quiet. You walk along the edge of a trench and look down. There is a darker layer, a lighter layer, a band of ash, a patch of compacted clay, a small bone fragment, a charred seed, a potsherd with a faint pattern. Nothing here shouts. Everything whispers. The evidence we do have points to countless ordinary moments preserved by accident, a fire, a flood, a collapse of a wall, a discarded broken tool. Here is a gentle joke, because the modern world also runs on small stubborn work. You can tell archaeology is real because it is 90% careful note-taking and 10% people excitedly staring at a piece of pottery like it just told them a secret. You step into a lab space in your imagination. Bright lights, clean tables, tiny bags with labels. Someone measures. Someone photographs. Someone compares a shard to another shard. Most historians agree that modern archaeology uses many methods, including dating techniques, material analysis, and environmental reconstruction to build cautious narratives. The evidence we do have points to huge improvements in what we can infer, but also to limits. We cannot recover everything. We cannot reconstruct every conversation. We cannot translate every silence. One interpretation is that the feeling of an Anunnaki disappearance functions like a metaphor for those limits. If the record goes quiet, people often fill the gap with story. A fringe idea proposes that ancient gaps indicate deliberate erasure, secret histories, or vanished non-human actors. This theory isn't widely accepted, and mainstream scholarship emphasizes taphonomy preservation bias and the uneven survival of material evidence. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why the idea persists. Gaps feel personal. They feel like someone hiding something, even when they are just the universe being careless with paper and wood. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And when we cannot confirm, the honest move is not to declare a hidden truth, but to separate solid ground from mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You walk into a museum gallery where artifacts sit under glass. A clay tablet, a cylinder seal, a simple tool, a piece of jewellery. You watch visitors lean in their faces, lit by the soft glow of display lights. Someone reads a placard and nods as if they have absorbed the past in a single sentence. Someone else whispers a dramatic theory to their friend, because humans cannot resist the thrill of mystery. Most historians agree that public history often compresses complexity into digestible stories. The evidence we do have points to attention. We want accuracy, but we also want meaning. We want to know what happened, but we also want the story to feel satisfying. One interpretation is that when people ask what if human history started after the Anunnaki disappeared, they are really asking what if the beginning we tell is not the true beginning. A more cautious explanation could be that human history does not start once. It starts in many ways depending on what you mean by history. If history means written records, then it begins when writing begins. If history means lived experience, then it begins long before. If history means complex societies, then it begins when cities and states form. If history means the human mind trying to explain itself, then it begins every time someone looks at the past and feels a gap. Historians still argue whether myth should be treated mainly as symbolic storytelling or as a potential carrier of distorted memory of real events and conditions, even when it cannot be read as literal record. That debate is gentle and important because it lets you keep wonder without pretending certainty. It lets you enjoy the mist while respecting the ground. You leave the museum and step into a modern street at night. Cars pass. Neon hums. Someone laughs on a sidewalk. A distant siren rises and fades without urgency. Above the city lights, only a few stars are visible, but they are enough to remind you that the same sky still covers everything. You pause and listen to the steady background noise of modern life, and you notice how similar it feels to ancient life. In one way, a constant hum, a constant attempt to make order out of complexity. And now the pacing slows. You imagine yourself back at a quiet dig site just after sunset, when the workday is done and the air cools. The trench sits open and dark like a mouth that has finished speaking for now. The tools are set aside. The notebooks are closed. The people have gone to eat dinner, to rest, to dream. You stand alone with the earth. You realize that the question you carried tonight was never meant to be answered like a math problem. It was meant to be carried like a lantern. What if human history started after the Anunnaki disappeared? What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the disappearance is not a spaceship leaving, but a symbol for the moment when people stop relying on a shared certainty and start building their own? What if the feeling of a beginning is created by what survives? The first written mark, the first law, the first temple, the first archive, the first layer a trowel can uncover. And in that realization, you feel oddly comforted, because it means the past is not a closed book. It is a long shelf of fragments, and each generation arranges them differently, not to deceive, but to understand. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues. And if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you let your breathing slow. Inhale quiet and easy, like drawing in cool air near a river at dawn. Exhale longer, like letting dust settle after footsteps. The world does not demand an answer from you right now. It only asks you to rest. You picture the small objects again, not as trophies, but as soft anchors. A reed stylus pressing a wedge into clay. A seal rolling its tiny picture into a damp surface. A weight settling a balance in a market. A star rising on schedule. A trowel scraping gently at a layer of soil. These are the humble tools that stitch time together. And you allow yourself one last thought, slow and kind. Even if history feels like it starts after something disappears, it is still human hands that carry it forward, human eyes that watch, human voices that tell, human minds that wonder without rushing. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and that is okay. The unknown can be calm. The unknown can be a quiet space where imagination breathes without pretending it is fact. The night grows softer. The sounds of the modern world fade into a steady hum, like a fan in the corner of a dark room. Your muscles loosen, your jaw unclenches, your thoughts slow down, not because you solved the past, but because you stopped asking it to hurry. And as you drift towards sleep, you keep one gentle promise to yourself. You can love the mist and still respect the ground.